the unexpected harvest, German POWs in American fields.
In the scorching summer of 1944, something extraordinary was happening in the cotton fields of Georgia, the sugar beet farms of Nebraska, and the apple orchards of New York. Young men with blonde hair and sunburned faces bent over rows of crops, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. They spoke to each other in German, laughed at inside jokes, and occasionally broke into song. To any distant observer, they might have looked like ordinary farmhands, but sewn onto the backs of their blue denim work shirts were the letters PW in bold white paint. These were prisoners of war, enemy soldiers captured in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, now standing on American soil doing the very thing America desperately needed, feeding the nation. This is the story of one of World War II's strangest and least known chapters, a time when nearly 500,000 German soldiers found themselves not behind barbed wire and guard towers, but working alongside American farmers, eating at their tables, and in some cases, becoming part of their communities. It's a story that challenges everything we think we know about war, about enemies, and about the resilience of human connection in the darkest of times. The crisis began long before the first German prisoner ever set foot on American farmland. When Pearl Harbor thrust America into the war in December 1941, it triggered a massive mobilization unlike anything the country had seen. 16 million Americans would eventually serve in uniform, and that meant 16 million people who weren't working in factories, weren't driving trucks, and crucially, weren't harvesting the food that would feed not just America, but its allies fighting across Europe and the Pacific. The agricultural labor shortage became so severe by 1943 that crops were literally rotting in fields. In California's Central Valley, tomatoes turned to mush on the vine. In the Midwest, wheat stood unharvested as winter approached. In Florida, citrus groves went unpicked. The irony was bitter. America was fighting a war to preserve freedom and democracy, yet it couldn't even harvest its own food. The solution came from an unlikely source. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be put to work, provided they weren't engaged in military production or dangerous labor. Agricultural work fit perfectly within these guidelines. Starting in 1943, the U.S. government began establishing POW camps across the country, initially to house Italian prisoners, then increasingly German soldiers as the Allied campaign in Europe intensified. By 1945, there were over 650 camps scattered across 46 states, housing around 425,000 German POWs. These ranged from massive base camps holding thousands of prisoners to small branch camps with just a few dozen men. And remarkably, many of these camps were located in the heart of agricultural communities. Let me take you to Concordia, Kansas, a small farming town where in the spring of 1944, a branch camp was established to house 200 German prisoners. The local farmers had been skeptical at first. These were enemy soldiers, men who had fought against American boys, perhaps even killed some. How could they trust them? How could they work alongside them? But desperation overcame distrust. The wheat needed harvesting, and there was simply no one else to do it. The first morning the prisoners arrived in the fields, tensions ran high. Armed guards stood watchful. The farmers kept their distance. The Germans themselves seemed uncertain, many of them farm boys who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and never wanted to fight in the first place. But something remarkable happened that first day and in the days that followed. The prisoners worked. They worked hard. Many of them came from rural Bavaria, from the agricultural regions of Saxony, from farming communities that looked remarkably similar to the Kansas prairie. They knew wheat, knew how to handle a scythe, understood the rhythm of harvest. They didn't complain about the back-breaking labor or the prairie heat. In fact, many seemed grateful for the opportunity to be outdoors, to be doing something productive, to feel useful again after months of sitting idle in camps. And the American farmers noticed. A good worker is a good worker, regardless of what uniform he once wore. The daily routine of these POW farm laborers followed a predictable pattern. They'd wake at dawn in their barracks, basic wooden structures that were nevertheless far more comfortable than the foxholes and trenches many had lived in during combat. After breakfast, usually consisting of oatmeal, bread, and coffee, they'd be loaded onto trucks and transported to nearby farms under the supervision of guards. The work varied by season and region. In the South, they picked cotton, cut sugarcane, and harvested peanuts. In California, they worked in vegetable fields and fruit orchards. In the Mountain West, they topped sugar beets, a miserable job that left your back screaming and your hands bleeding. In the Northeast, they picked apples and worked in canneries. They were paid for their labor, though not much, 80 cents per day in scrip that could be spent at the camp canteen on cigarettes, candy, and sundries. What's fascinating is how quickly the relationship between prisoners and farmers evolved. In many communities, the initial fear and hostility gave way to something approaching normalcy. Farmers began requesting specific prisoners they'd worked with before, men they knew were reliable. Some prisoners were allowed to work with minimal supervision, trusted to complete tasks on their own. There are accounts of farmers' wives bringing lemonade and sandwiches to the fields, of prisoners being invited to take breaks in the shade of farmhouse porches, of conversations that started haltingly in broken English and German, and gradually became easier. In Colorado, a farmer named Robert Meyer found himself working alongside a German prisoner named Hans Schmidt. Hans had been a farmer in Bavaria before the war, drafted into the army in 1941, and captured in Tunisia in 1943. He and Robert discovered they had remarkably similar lives, both raising wheat and cattle, both worrying about rainfall and market prices, both missing their families. Robert's son was fighting in France. Hans's brother had been killed on the Eastern Front. They should have been enemies, but standing together in a wheat field under the Colorado sky, they were just two farmers trying to bring in a harvest. Not everyone accepted this arrangement gracefully. Some American communities strongly opposed having enemy prisoners in their midst. In some towns, restaurants refused to serve guards who brought prisoners in for meals. Local newspapers ran editorials denouncing the coddling of Nazi soldiers. There were incidents, tensions that occasionally boiled over. In one camp in Utah, a fight broke out between American guards and German prisoners after a disagreement over work assignments. In Arizona, 3 German POWs were murdered by fellow prisoners for being too cooperative with Americans, suspected of being traitors to the Reich. The war was still raging after all. American boys were still dying in Europe. For many families who had lost sons or husbands, the sight of German prisoners walking freely through their towns, working in their fields, was deeply painful. The prisoners themselves were a diverse group, and this diversity often created tension within the camps. There were the hardcore Nazis, usually officers or members of elite units, who maintained strict military discipline, held secret ceremonies celebrating Hitler's birthday, and intimidated any prisoner who seemed too friendly with Americans. Then there were the good Germans, as some Americans called them. Men who claimed they'd never supported Hitler, who were grateful to be out of the war, who genuinely wanted to cooperate. And then there was everyone in between, young conscripts who just wanted to survive and go home, career soldiers who maintained their dignity but caused no trouble, men who were exhausted by years of war and simply wanted peace and routine. In many camps, the hardcore Nazis essentially ran internal governments, enforcing their own rules, punishing cooperation with Americans, maintaining the fiction that Germany would still win the war, even as news filtered in of Allied advances. American camp commanders struggled with this. The Geneva Convention required that POWs be allowed to organize themselves, to elect spokesmen, to maintain their military structure. But this sometimes meant that Nazi ideology continued to flourish behind the wire, that prisoners who wanted to break away from that ideology lived in fear. Yet despite these tensions, the agricultural program was remarkably successful. By 1945, German POWs were contributing significantly to American food production. In some states, particularly in the South and Mountain West, they made up a substantial portion of the agricultural workforce. In Louisiana, they helped save the sugarcane harvest, In Florida, they kept the citrus industry operating. In the Pacific Northwest, they worked in lumber camps, felling trees that would become lumber for the war effort. They earned their keep and then some. The program was so successful that many farmers dreaded the end of the war, knowing they'd lose their most reliable workers. The human stories that emerged from this period are endlessly fascinating. In Texas, a German POW named Werner Kritzler worked on a ranch owned by the Lee family. Werner had been an artist before the war, and during his lunch breaks, he'd sketch cattle, landscapes, the rolling Texas hills. Mrs. Lee noticed his talent and brought him paper and better pencils. Werner began creating more elaborate drawings, which Mrs. Lee framed and hung in her home. When the war ended and Werner was repatriated to Germany, they corresponded for years. He eventually returned to Texas in the 1950s as a free man, met Mrs. Lee again, and she helped him establish himself as an artist in San Antonio. In Nebraska, a young German soldier named Fritz Engelmann worked on a farm owned by a widow named Martha Jensen. Martha's husband had died 2 years earlier, and she was struggling to keep the farm running with her teenage son doing most of the work. Fritz became indispensable to her operation, working harder than any hired hand she'd ever employed. He fixed machinery, built a new chicken coop, even helped her son with his math homework in the evenings, the boy struggling with algebra while Fritz explained equations at the kitchen table. When the war ended, Fritz returned to Germany only to find his hometown destroyed, his family scattered. He wrote to Martha asking if there might be work for him if he could emigrate. She sponsored him. He returned in 1948, and 5 years later, they married. Her neighbors were scandalized, but Martha didn't care. She'd found a good man and a good farmer, and the war was over. Not all stories ended so warmly. In some communities, romances developed between German prisoners and American women, relationships that were forbidden, scandalous, and often tragic. In Wisconsin, a young woman named Anna was ostracized by her community when it was discovered she'd been meeting secretly with a German POW named Karl. Her father refused to speak to her. Local boys who'd returned from the war threatened Karl. When Karl was shipped back to Germany in 1946, Anna never heard from him again. She never married, spending the rest of her life in that small town, always wondering what had happened to the German boy she'd fallen in love with during those strange war years. The camps themselves varied wildly in their conditions and atmosphere. Some were relatively pleasant, with recreational facilities, libraries, even small theaters where prisoners put on plays and concerts. German POWs were generally well treated compared to prisoners in other theaters of the war. They received adequate food, medical care, and were protected under the Geneva Convention. Some prisoners later said their time in American camps was the best period of the war for them, a respite from the horror of combat, the constant fear of death. Others found the captivity humiliating, the work demeaning, the separation from their families unbearable. Many didn't know if their homes still existed, if their wives and children had survived the Allied bombing campaigns. In Alabama, there was a camp called Aliceville that held over 6,000 German prisoners at its peak. It became famous for its elaborate prisoner productions. The Germans built a full theater, complete with stage lighting and scenery. They put on operas, classical concerts, even comedy shows. Local Americans would sometimes attend these performances, sitting in the audience watching enemy soldiers sing Beethoven and Wagner. It was surreal. This pocket of German culture thriving in the Deep South, while across the ocean, cities were being reduced to rubble. The food in these camps was another point of controversy. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were supposed to receive rations equivalent to what American soldiers received. This meant German POWs were often eating better than German civilians back home, better even than some American civilians dealing with rationing. There are accounts of prisoners gaining weight during their captivity, of men who had been half-starved during the North Africa campaign arriving thin and gaunt and leaving healthy and robust. When American soldiers liberated concentration camps in 1945 and saw the horrors of Nazi atrocities, there was fury that German POWs in America had been treated so well. Some guards became hostile. Some camp conditions deteriorated, but by and large, the system maintained its adherence to international law. The work in the fields created bonds that transcended the war. In Oregon, a group of German prisoners worked on a farm owned by the Hoffman family, German Americans who had immigrated in the 1920s. The prisoners and the Hoffmans could speak German together, and the conversations flowed easily. They discussed farming techniques, shared recipes, talked about the regions of Germany where their families came from. The prisoners taught the Hoffman children German folk songs. Mrs. Hoffman baked traditional German pastries and brought them to the workers. For a few hours each day, the war seemed very far away, and they were just Germans sharing a moment of home. But the war was always there, lurking beneath the surface. In the spring of 1945, as news reached the camps that Germany was collapsing, that Hitler was dead, that the Reich had surrendered, reactions varied wildly. Some prisoners wept with relief. Others refused to believe it. The hardcore Nazis claimed it was American propaganda. Some prisoners became depressed, realizing they'd have to return to a devastated homeland. Others were jubilant, knowing they'd survived, that they'd see their families again. The farmers who had worked with them for months or years shared in these emotions, celebrating with some, consoling others. The repatriation process took time. It wasn't until late 1945 and into 1946 that most German POWs were shipped back to Europe. Some didn't want to leave. Men who had come from East Germany feared Soviet occupation. Men whose cities had been destroyed didn't know where they'd go. Some lobbied to stay, to be allowed to immigrate, but American law was strict. They were prisoners of war, and they had to return home. The goodbyes on many farms were emotional. Prisoners who had worked the same fields for 2 or 3 years embraced the farmers they'd labored alongside. Farmers pressed gifts into their hands, addresses scribbled on paper, invitations to write, to visit someday when the world was normal again. In Montana, a rancher named Tom Sullivan had employed the same 6 German prisoners throughout the harvest seasons of 1944 and 1945. On their last day, Tom hosted a dinner for them at his ranch house. His wife cooked a feast, and they sat around the table, Germans and Americans, sharing a meal. Tom gave each man a wool blanket and a carton of cigarettes for the journey home. One of the prisoners, a young man named Dieter, gave Tom a carved wooden box he'd made in his spare time, intricate designs of wheat stalks and mountains etched into the lid. Tom kept that box on his desk for the rest of his life. Dieter wrote once after returning to Germany, a brief letter saying he'd found his mother alive, that he was trying to rebuild. Then the correspondence stopped, and Tom never heard from him again. The legacy of this program is complex. On one hand, it was a practical solution to a genuine crisis. German POW labor helped keep American agriculture functioning during a critical period. It demonstrated that even in the midst of total war, there were limits, rules that civilized nations followed, human connections that could bridge even the deepest divides. Many of the prisoners who worked on American farms returned to Germany with positive impressions of America, stories of fair treatment and kindness that countered the propaganda they'd been fed about American brutality. Some became advocates for democracy and reconciliation in post-war Germany. On the other hand, the program highlighted uncomfortable truths. German POWs in the South sometimes had access to restaurants and facilities that were denied to Black Americans under Jim Crow laws. There are accounts of German prisoners being served in segregated diners while Black American soldiers were turned away. This grotesque irony was not lost on Black Americans at the time, and it fueled the growing civil rights movement after the war. The fact that enemy soldiers could be treated better than American citizens based on skin color revealed the deep sickness at the heart of American society. There's also the question of how many of these prisoners had participated in Nazi atrocities. Most of the POWs in America were regular Wehrmacht soldiers, not SS or Gestapo, but the Wehrmacht was complicit in war crimes on the Eastern Front. Some of the men working in American fields had probably been part of operations that destroyed villages, that participated in the Holocaust's machinery, that committed acts that would haunt survivors for generations. They weren't all innocent farm boys reluctantly drafted into service. Some were true believers in Nazism, men who would have continued fighting if they hadn't been captured. The American farmers who worked beside them, who sometimes befriended them, didn't know their full stories, didn't know what they'd done or witnessed before capture. Yet despite these complicated moral questions, the human connections forged during this period were real. In the decades after the war, many German POWs who had worked in America returned as immigrants or tourists, seeking out the farms where they'd labored, the families they'd known. Reunions happened across the country. In Iowa in the 1960s, a man named Friedrich showed up at a farm he'd worked on during the war, now a successful businessman visiting America for a conference. The farmer who'd employed him, now elderly, welcomed him with tears and embraces. They spent an afternoon walking the fields, Friedrich pointing out the barn he'd helped repair, the fence line he'd built, both men marveling at how much had changed and how much remained the same. There are monuments now, scattered across America, marking where these camps once stood. In small towns in Kansas and Nebraska and Texas, historical markers note that German prisoners of war lived and worked here during World War II. Some local historical societies have preserved camp buildings, created small museums with photographs and artifacts. Elderly residents share memories of the German boys who worked their family farms, who became part of the landscape of their childhoods. The story of German POWs in American agriculture reveals something profound about the nature of war and humanity. These men were enemies, participants in the most destructive conflict in human history, soldiers of a regime responsible for unspeakable evil. Yet on American farms, they became something else: workers, colleagues, sometimes friends. They proved that even in the midst of war, there were moments of ordinary humanity, moments when people could see past uniforms and flags to recognize shared struggles and common ground. A German farm boy harvesting wheat in Kansas had more in common with the Kansas farmer beside him than with the Nazi leadership in Berlin. An American widow struggling to save her farm in Nebraska could recognize dignity and worth in a German prisoner who worked hard and treated her with respect. This doesn't mean the war was any less terrible or that the Nazi regime was any less evil. It doesn't erase the Holocaust or the millions who died in combat or the cities reduced to rubble. But it does suggest that even within the machinery of total war, there were cracks where humanity could emerge, where people could choose kindness over cruelty, cooperation over hatred. The German prisoners who harvested American crops were still prisoners, still enemies, still participants in a war of aggression. But they were also young men far from home, frightened and uncertain, desperate for purpose and normalcy. The American farmers who employed them were still loyal patriots supporting their country's war effort. But they were also practical people who needed help bringing in crops, and they were capable of recognizing that the young German working beside them was a human being deserving of basic decency. In the end, the story of German POWs laboring in American fields during World War II is a story about the complexity of war, about how global conflicts play out in local communities, about how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances. It's about Kansas farmers and German farm boys finding common ground in wheat fields. It's about widows and young soldiers forming unexpected connections. It's about communities wrestling with fear and prejudice and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, choosing compassion. It's about the strange places where the war years led people, to cotton fields in Georgia where enemies worked side by side, to Nebraska farms where friendships formed across battle lines, to moments of shared humanity in the midst of humanity's darkest hour. And it's a reminder that history is never as simple as we'd like it to be. That wars are fought not just by nations and armies, but by individual people making individual choices. And that sometimes, even in the darkest times, those choices could be surprisingly decent.